Welcome to another edition of Daily Airline News, focusing on the loss of the Boeing 737s, Ethiopian and Lion Air. I'm Jeffrey Thomas and delighted to say, joined by my co-host Richard Godfrey in Frankfurt. Good morning to you, Richard.
And good afternoon to you, Jeffrey.
I notice that you've now got in the balloon and moved to a tropical island.
Yeah, on holiday.
Yeah, and I'm about to leave on that aeroplane you can see behind me. Uh,
Ah, good.
This episode, viewers, is called MCAS. It's episode 216. And as expected, we've had a large number of viewers respond to the first Boeing 737 MAX episode in our series of 6. This episode is answering the comments and questions raised in the first episode. In future episodes, we'll be doing a deep dive into the FAA and Boeing self-regulation, the Lion Air and Ethiopian MAX tragedies, the media reporting of same, and the aviation industry lessons learned. You will not believe some of the things you will hear in this series on the MAX. The focus of our viewer comments so far is the MCAS system. So we start off with one comment from Future System 738. He says, I have way over 12,000 hours in command on all the later 737s from the 300 series onwards. I can't find too many errors or omissions in your story. Well done. Though I still absolutely maintain that well-trained pilots would not have crashed in the MAX, and yes, even with MCAS misbehaving. Of course, this is also proven by other instances of MCAS runaway where the pilots handled it just fine. Richard, perhaps you might like to comment on that.
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words to start off with. And Boeing has delivered 1,965 737 MAX aircraft and a further 6,782 are on order. There have been 3 recorded incidents of a MCAS runaway. The first on Lion Air in Denpasar to Jakarta, the 28th of October 2018, which was the previous flight of PKLQP. And then the crash flight one day later in Jakarta on the 29th of October. And the third one was the Ethiopian ET302 in Addis Ababa on the 10th of March 2019. The US congressional materials compiled 24 NASA ASRS reports relating to the 737 MAX between October 2017 and December 2018. And those voluntary reports aren't verified all as being MCAS events. Several media have cautioned that they reflect all kinds of pitch or autopilot issues. But in total, out of 2,000 aircraft delivered, there's only 3 confirmed reports and 24 other incidents or possible incidents. So I think it's a pretty good track record for the 737 MAX.
And one thing we should also mention, there's 2,000 aircraft in service, around about 2,000 aircraft in service, and on average they do 4 flights a day, sometimes 5. So that is 10,000 flights, up to 10,000 flights a day for the 737 MAX, between 8 and 10. So yeah, it's an extraordinary record of reliability. Me at NZ 2320, there is a fundamental difference between trim runaway and the MCAS fault that is consistently misunderstood even by 737 pilots. It's covered well on the Mentor Pilot channel. Effectively, the MAX MCAS system is reset after each encounter trim input, resulting in a series of inputs with a progressively worsening stabilizer position after each reset. This does not happen with a trim runaway, which is relatively easy to deal with. Richard.
Yeah, that's a good point, but I would point out that's how it used to be with the original MCAS system design. That's not how it is now. And, thank you for mentioning the Mentor Pilot channel. We frequently recommend the
Mm,
Mentor Pilot channel.
mm,
We clearly stated in part one of our MAX series that all Boeing 737s, including the MAX, have both the STS, the Speed Trim System, and also, but only on the MAX, the MCAS system, as well as the STS system. We explained in detail it's a software based flight control law integrated with the speed trim system, and its purpose is to automatically command nose down stabilizer trim in very specific situations. You have to have a high angle of attack, you have to be in manual flight, and you have to have the flaps up. And you need that basically to mimic the pitch stability of the NG series 737. We also discussed in detail the following questions. Why use software rather than just accept the new handling qualities? How does the MCAS work in practice? Was the MCAS ever meant to be noticeable to pilots? Was the Boeing failsafe? What is the Boeing failsafe if MCAS keep pushing the nose down? And perhaps you should watch the episode again because you appear to have missed most of it.
Reborn Rocker Vids. I do hope you don't blindly defend Boeing all the way through this series.
Well, where have we been blindly defending Boeing? I ask. In fact, we replied online to your comment, Reborn Rocker Vids, and we said, not at all. Mistakes were made by Boeing. So I don't see where you conclude we're blindly defending.
Hmm. So at Mark AV Integrator 6266, hello gentlemen, I am not a pilot, but as knowledgeable as a civilian enthusiast can get regarding aviation. Yes, I haven't missed one of your Air India episodes either. When the MAX crashes occurred, I obsessively listened to every podcast that I carefully chose to listen to based upon the criteria of whether the person speaking is an expert in their field. I listened to the entire US congressional hearings on the 737 MAX. I read every word of the preliminary and final reports as well. It is with great excitement and anticipation that I await your perspective on this unfortunate, tragic, and likely entirely preventable series of events. Even in the original iteration of the MCAS, despite some questionable engineering decisions made by Boeing. In simple layman's terms, the way I describe it, use the example of cruise control in a car. While on a long trip at higher speeds, one can engage this system that will maintain the speed of your car at its speed set point. To disengage it, you either press cancel or more typically press the brake pedal. These actions were the memory items you did when you observed you were closing in on traffic or a red light, and you did so instinctively. Then they introduced smart cruise control, which also slowed you down in response to slower or stopping traffic. If, however, the system was not reacting fast enough for your liking, you, as the experienced driver, would instinctively press the brake and take control away from the system. The fact that this was the newer, enhanced version of the system didn't matter. It still basically worked the same way and was disabled the same way by you, the experienced driver. When the situation called for it, based on the basic reaction to the system that has been baked into most cars and the 737 for many years, the driver or pilot knows what to do, hitting the brake or cutting off the stab trim switches. I look forward to your expert analysis. Thank you for taking us along with you.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Mark, and thank you for that. If you are, however, the pilot of a Boeing 737 MAX, and as in the case of Lion Air, you turn up for work feeling like shit, coughing all the time and telling your colleagues that you've got the flu. You then feel pretty miserable, and perhaps you should have called in sick. But nevertheless, you feel duty bound to get on with your job. And then you get into an aircraft, then colleagues haven't told you all the problems with this aircraft in the previous days. And the maintenance engineers tell you, no worries, we fixed the problem and installed a new AOA sensor. Fortunately, they didn't install it quite correctly, or at least not calibrated. And when you take off, so, lo and behold, all the problems of previous days, which you weren't informed about, overwhelm you. And it was actually quicker and sooner and worse than the previous days. And you wish you had been forewarned. You don't think to declare a mayday or a pan, and ATC treat you like normal business and keep telling you what to do. And you're trying to concentrate on fixing a problem. And then your first officer can't even remember the memory items and put his foot on the brake, as the previous commenter suggested. So I ask, what are you supposed to do?
And if I can add to that, that captain who had the flu was in fact controlling the plane. He was doing the toggle back part. But then for some reason, he decided to look it up in the manual and handed the plane to the first officer, as you suggest, Richard. And technically, the first officer had failed his simulator test because he didn't understand the concept of a stall. And that's in the report. And we're going to go into that in much greater detail when we talk about Lion Air. So a real disaster. Anyway, at Ivan IV105, this MCAS looks like a quickly thrown together fly-by-wire device with input sensors generating controlling commands. Spoilers follow. D. From what I've heard, they had a problem with redundancy, one sensor only, and this sensor failed. MCAS went berserk, pushing the plane to the ground in a loop until the plane crashed. Well, that's not the way it happened. But Richard, I'll let you explain.
Let's take Ivan's comment step by step. Number one, he says, quickly thrown together, fly-by-wire device with input sensors generating controlling commands. Well, the MCAS wasn't a full fly-by-wire system like you find on an Airbus, for example, where all flight controls are computer mediated. It was instead an add-on augmentation law to help the MAX handle differently in high AOA sensor conditions. The informal phrasing you use implies MCAS was designed hastily and bolted on an otherwise conventional control system, and this was not the case. And the second point you make, problem with redundancy, one sensor only. And the original MCAS design did rely on input from only one angle of attack vane at a time, either the left or the right, depending on the flight. And this meant there was no cross-check between the sensors. If that single vane gave bad data, then MCAS would activate incorrectly. The third point you make, the sensor failed, MCAS went berserk, pushing the plane to the ground in a loop. In both Lion Air and the Ethiopian crashes, a faulty AOA sensor fed erroneous high angle of attack data to MCAS. So MCAS believed the aircraft was about to stall, and so it repeatedly trimmed nose down. And each time the pilot countered with electric trim, MCAS reset. But then 5 seconds later, it reactivated, creating a loop of nose down trim commands. And without intervention via the stab trim cutout switches, this cycle could overpower the crew. But the simple solution was to use the stab trim cutout switches. The commenter is informally describing how MCAS relied on a single AOA sensor, which, when it failed, caused the repeated uncommanded nose down, and the crew couldn't recover from it, ultimately causing the crashes. However, the reality is a simple memory item could have saved both situations, and was the case in all other MCAS incidents, even in Lion Air and even on the same aircraft the day before. They managed the simple memory item, and the aircraft landed safely despite this problem. The 737 MAX was certified under the FAA Part 25 transport category rules, but crucially, as a derivative of the 737 Next Generation NG, and not as a brand new aircraft type. This allowed Boeing to keep the same type rating for pilots and avoid mandatory simulator retraining. To preserve this continuity, the new system MCAS was supposed to be invisible to the pilot and fit into the existing 737 control philosophy. Boeing classified MCAS failures as a hazardous but not catastrophic event under their safety analysis. So I think the whole story has got out of hand.
Yes. Mary Beth McCoy, I hope you'll address some confusion I have. After the 737 MAX tragedies, it was widely reported that the MCAS system had been installed by Boeing, but airlines and pilots were never told about its existence. This was done to avoid having to require additional pilot training or type ratings, and apparently directly led to these crashes when the pilots did not know how to overcome the MCAS system. But in your commentary, you point out that the actions pilots are to take in such a situation is a memory item, which leads me to think that the pilots were to blame for the crashes, since they should have immediately known, based on previous training, to the extent that they'd be able to recall from memory and initiate exactly what corrective action was necessary. Well, apparently they didn't, so it seems like some additional explanation is needed here. Were the pilots simply lacking in their training, or was the fact that MCAS system was hidden from them and they were not aware of its existence to blame for them not being able to respond to the emergency? Thank you so much for your top-notch research. The thoroughness and clarity of your explanations is so far beyond any other I have found on the internet. I have watched your channel daily since I found it shortly after the Air India crash, and both of you do a stellar job. Keep up the great work.
Well, thank you for that comment, Mary. And you have actually just outlined the next 3 episodes in your comment. There is far more to this story than the media will have you believe. And there is far more to the 2 MAX crashes than the media will have you believe. And we will explain all in depth in the coming episodes. And it is a long and complicated and multifaceted story in both the Lion Air and the Ethiopian crash events.
Mm. So Joe Costaca, 1298. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm very curious to hear about the CVR and FDR data that was recovered from those two disasters, how it was disseminated. We know what eventually happened with regarding to MCAS. I worked for years in a nuclear supply industry and know about highly regulated environments and certifications. I also know that there's always the human factor, whether it be behind a desk or in a cockpit. It's always the human factor that is the root cause, in my humble opinion, such as we will eventually find with 171 being related to maintenance lapses. The best airplane is only as capable as the pilot in control, and the best pilot is only as capable as his aircraft. We simply cannot afford to become sloppy, complacent, and mediocre. Good
Yeah,
comments.
very good comment. And you point out quite clearly designers, manufacturers, operators, maintainers, and regulators all have to work together as a team in any industry to make sure it's safe. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about the nuclear supply industry or the aviation industry. The same is also true for buildings or roads or rail or ships or pharmaceuticals. They are all carefully regulated and they require the manufacturers and the developers to work together as a team to keep it safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to note, because we're probably giving away a little bit here from the future episodes, but today, all Lion Air and Ethiopian pilot training is done by Boeing. So that tells you a lot.
It makes a
Um,
point, doesn't it?
yeah. At Toon Van der Pass 7604, many channels suggest that the MCAS system on the 737 MAX was unique, but from other sources I've heard that it was originally implemented first on the KC tanker aircraft. What's your take on this?
Yeah, well, you're right, but not fully right. The KC-46A Pegasus, which was a Boeing 767 derivative, had not a MCAS system per se, it had a function called MCAS. And that was a completely different development from the Boeing 737 MAX MCAS system. So Boeing had already coined the term maneuvering characteristic augmentation system previously, and that function was used on the KC-46A in the flight control laws. And this was a fly-by-wire augmentation in the military tanker variant of the Boeing 767. It's not the same, however, as the MAX. It was part of the flight control system to adjust handling qualities, and it did not rely on a single AOA vane, nor continuously trim nose down, as in the original MCAS design from the MAX. The MCAS was redesigned not to rely on a single AOA vane and not to continuously trim nose down on the MAX. And the KC-46A was part of a longitudinal stability augmentation, which is to preserve the military standard that were enforced for the military aircraft. It was to ensure the pitch force per G and the stick-free static stability met the US Air Force criteria. And without augmentation, the 767-2C airframe in certain load and center of gravity conditions did not meet the required gradients. And to prevent excessive pitch up tendencies, they introduced this augmentation system and function called MCAS. And the to make the tanker aircraft feel like a standard transport, so tanker crew transition from other Boeings would be easier, and the augmentation would smooth the pitch response to match pilot expectations. And the goal of the KC-46 was not to surprise pilots with unusual stick forces or nonlinear pitch up at high angle of attack. So it's similar in some ways to the MAX, where the goal was to make the pilot expectation appropriate to what they were familiar with on previous similar aircraft. So the 737NG should behave like the 737 MAX, and the KC-46 military aircraft should behave like other military transport and aircraft that the pilots were familiar with.
And we should also remind viewers, and we did mention it in the first episode, Richard, that Airbus uses all sorts of software in the background to ensure that its family of aircraft behave basically in the same way. So a pilot can get off a narrow-bodied 180-seat A320 and then walk across the terminal and get into a 350-passenger A330 and fly it, cross crew.
Yeah.
Qualification. And that's a big selling point for Airbus. And they're the ones who really pushed that and pioneered it. So there's lots of software in the background. And also on military aircraft, there's quite a few. We mentioned the Pegasus tanker, but there's many military fighters that absolutely rely on software in the background to make them controllable. Otherwise, the pilots couldn't fly them. So it's a very complex subject, and I know we're drifting away a little bit, but I think it just adds a bit of perspective. But Mark Howlett 9951 says, I think on the tanker they used two sensors because the military specified it. Richard.
Yeah, that's correct. The KC-46A Pegasus, this derivative of the 767, used dual angle of attack sensors. And in fact, more than just those two sources of pitch-related data were available to the flight computer control systems. The KC-46 was fed by dual AOA vanes and other sensors with redundancy and cross-checking. In fact, the MCAS function was part of a triplex fail operational fly-by-wire augmentation law, meaning that multiple sensor channels, AOA, airspeed, inertial data, are cross-checked before the augmentation applies any stabilizer input.
Yeah. Now we're talking angle of attack sensors. And just referencing back to Lion Air for a minute, we should also mention that the angle of attack sensors that were fitted to the Lion Air aircraft, the one that went from Bali to Jakarta, that was a faulty sensor because it was a non-Boeing sensor. It was from another supplier, and they took it off that aircraft and replaced it with another faulty sensor from a non-Boeing supplier. And that particular supplier was eventually shut down by the American FAA after after that tragedy. So, Richard, thank you very much indeed for all your work in answering those questions from our viewers on the 737 MCAS saga. And we're coming back to the MCAS 737 story later on this week, possibly Sunday. But tomorrow we're going to be coming back to you with Whisper for Experts, focusing on the MH370 search and Richard's technology, harnessing of a technology to find MH370, which will be absolutely fascinating. So, Richard, thanks again for all your work today.
You're very welcome.
And viewers, thank you for subscribing to us. Thank you for watching us. Thank you for liking us. Please do join us and support responsible journalism. And thank you for the wonderful comments, and thank you for the great questions. We do appreciate them very much indeed. And we do look forward to your company tomorrow. Thank you.